To introduce the keynote speaker. He is the world-known scientist, author, host, and producer of many TV specials, and above all, the leading Canadian environmentalist. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving Dr. David Suzuki a warm welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
You do that after I finish. I'll watch. If you don't stand up when I finish, I'll be really disappointed. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for coming tonight. I know Friday night is a night everybody gets up and goes out on the town, so I'm really happy you've taken the night out to come here and listen to this. I know that there are environmental concerns that have been raised in this community. I have not followed the issues. I am not here as an expert to comment on the kind of issues you as a community are involved. So I want to get that very clear. I'm not Joe Smartass coming in here to tell you anything about the kinds of issues you confront. The work that my wife Tara Cullis and I have been doing over the last few years involving our foundation has focused on local communities which we believe must be the unit of survival into the next millennium. If we don't have vibrant, sustainable communities, we certainly are not going to be able to create a sustainable future for the world. So I don't agree with the phrase, think globally and act locally. Because I've found over time that when people think globally, the problems are so immense and so distant that they feel really helpless to be able to do anything about it. So my advice, whose is that? Hello, hello? My advice is think and act locally, because only by doing that do we have any hope of being able to affect things on a global scale. So I'm really very happy then to come to the community of Port Moody and try to provide some kind of context within which you may be able to see or frame the issues you're involved with here in a more obvious way. So I'd like to begin by personalizing things and tell you a little bit, at the risk of seeming very conceited, tell you a bit about my own history. My grandparents emigrated to Canada from Japan early in this century. They were fishers and boat builders, and I've heard it said that at least one Suzuki-built boat is still in use today, and I hope it's true because it would make me very proud. But I do know from fishers, old-time fishermen, that a Suzuki-built boat was a very well-built boat. My father was born on the grounds of the Eburn sawmill on Annacis Island 88 years ago. My mother was born in Vancouver. I was born in Vancouver, and I grew up for the first 6 years of my life in Vancouver, and I still remember driving with my father on weekends we lived in Marpole, actually, which is near the Oak Street Bridge. I can remember driving with him in an old car out to the Vedder River, where he would fish for steelhead, and I would occasionally catch a small rainbow if I was lucky. When the Second World War began, my parents were in their early 30s. They were devastated by being classified as enemy aliens and being shipped out of Vancouver. We ended up in a town called Slocan City, which was an old silver mine left over from the late 1890s. There it was an absolutely shattering thing for my mother and father, who were Canadian born and raised here all their lives. But for me, a boy, it was one of the most wonderful, magical times of my life. You see, there were all these thousands of Japanese Canadians shipped up into the Slocan Valley. They had 2 teachers. I didn't go to school for a year and a half in one of the most wonderful places on this planet. It's a place, part of which is now preserved as Valhalla Provincial Park. And for me, it was a time of incredible activities spent in the mountains and on the rivers. I learned many biology lessons I still remember today. But for me, it was a time when I bonded with nature for the rest of my life. Remember, in 1942, there was no television anywhere on the planet. We didn't have to worry about getting home in time to watch a program. There was plenty to do out in nature. When the war ended, we decided that we wanted to stay in Canada because we were Canadians. And so the British Columbia government, which wanted to get rid of all Japanese, shipped us out east. And we ended up with my father working on a farm in Leamington, Ontario. If any of you are from Ontario, you know that Leamington is in Essex County, the southernmost county in Canada, on the same latitude as Northern California, right next to Point Pelee, which is now Point Pelee National Park. Again, as a boy, living in Leamington was wonderful. Leamington was about 35 miles from Windsor, which is right across the river from Detroit. And when I was about 12 or 11, I remember my father taking me to the Detroit Zoo. Now at that time, in the mid-40s, the Detroit Zoo was considered one of the great zoos in North America. And I remember vividly being overwhelmed by the abundance and the variety of living things on this planet. And it shaped my outlook. I dreamed of becoming a biologist. And the three places that I wanted to visit in my life were the Amazon River, I wanted to see the Serengeti Plains, and I wanted to go to Australia because I wanted to see a duck-billed platypus. We lived in Leamington for 4 years and then moved to London, Ontario in 1949. When we moved to London, the population of the city was 60,000 people. And boy, I remember when London grew to 100,000, we thought we'd really hit the big time because we were now growing and we're going to be a big city. When I grew up in London, we were very poor, and I spent countless hours fishing on the Thames River because we needed those fish to eat. And over the years, I grew to know every pool in that area of the Thames River. And it was fishing for the Thames that I saw the great annual runs of pike and silver bass. I used to catch channel catfish and carp. It was a very rich area. It was the Thames River where I first saw a soft-shelled turtle. I don't know how many of you have ever seen them. Amazing discovery for me as a boy. We lived right in the outskirts of London, and I could get on my bike, and in half an hour on a dirt road, Oxford Street, I could be out to Proudfoot Lane where my grandparents had a chicken farm. And I loved going there because down at the foot of the farm was a creek, and I would play there for hour after hour. That's where I first discovered freshwater clams. It's where I was sitting when I saw a hawk actually catch a gopher in the field. I learned some of my most profound lessons about biology sitting by that creek. Often I'd tell my folks I'm going to Grandma's farm, and I'd never get there because 10 minutes from our house was a huge swamp. And that was the most loved place on this planet for me. Every spring I would gather salamander eggs in that swamp. It was in the swamp that I first saw a wild skunk and a wild fox. I loved that swamp. I've gone back to London a number of times over the years. The last time was, in fact, in February of this year. But when I go back, I see a city that is a radically changed place from my childhood. London has over 300,000 people in it now. In that, since I was 12 years old, it's grown from 60,000 to 300,000, and boy, they want to grow more because they're a big modern city. And when I look at the Thames River, parents don't even let their children play in it, let alone eat anything that comes out of it because it's so terribly polluted. And my grandparents' farm now only grows high-rise apartments, and the creek at the bottom of their fields runs underground through culverts. And the beloved swamp that I spent so many hours and days in is now the site of a huge shopping mall. And so I wonder then, when I go back, it's called, I know the changes in London is called development. And when I talk to Londoners, they tell me how wealthy they are and how much better off they were than when I was a child. But when children spend their time in shopping malls and electronic arcades, Where will they find their connection with nature and their inspiration? Well, Londoners tell me, that's the price of progress. It isn't progress to use up what rightfully belongs to all future generations for a one-shot time now in one generation. That's not progress. Oh, Londoners tell me there's plenty more where that came from. There isn't plenty more where that came from. Because everywhere you go on this planet, people say, yeah, there aren't any now, but there's plenty more somewhere else. I have been in my life privileged to visit those places I dreamed of in my boyhood. I've been to the Amazon rainforest. I've been to the Serengeti. I've been to Australia many times, and many more places. The Arctic, the Antarctic, China, India, Russia. And whenever I go to one of these places, I seek out elders who have lived in the area all of their lives. People who are 70 and 80 years old, and I ask them, what was it like when you were a child? And everywhere I go on this planet, our elders tell us the same thing. It used to be different. There used to be trees here, and every year there used to be birds that came through. The rivers used to have fish that came up. In 1900, Vancouver had 52 wild rivers and creeks with salmon in them. Today there are 2, and at the rate we're going, there will be none by the end of this century. Everywhere people tell us there used to be, and they say it falls from their lips so easily. It fills me with fear whenever I hear that phrase today. Because if the things that used to be aren't here anymore, where on earth do we think they are? My father used to tell me how he used to go fishing in a rowboat along Stanley Park, and he would catch sea-run cutthroat. My father would go down to Kitsilano Park or beach, just go out in a rowboat and catch halibut. You know, when I came back to Vancouver in 1963, there was a thing called the Vancouver Sun Salmon Derby. I think some of you are old enough to remember that. You remember that? And those big Chinook that they used to catch and win prizes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, you remember that? They were intercepting the great Chinook run that was going up the Squamish River. There are no Chinook in the Squamish River today. So there is no Vancouver Sun Salmon Derby. And when I read Terry Glavin's latest book, Dead Reckoning, it grieves me to see that the Fraser River once had 128 million salmon that used to spawn up that river. Now, if there are 17 million, that's a sensational run. And this year, it's estimated there will be 1.4 million sockeye, so there will be no sockeye fishery. 128 million salmon. And now we're down to 1.4. Our elders tell us that not only this country, but this planet has changed beyond description within the span of a single human life. And all you have to do is take what our elders tell us they've seen as changes in their lives and simply project the trajectory of those changes and ask yourself, what is going to be left for our children and our grandchildren? Is this progress?
No!
As a biologist, thank you, and I admire you for being here, because she's telling you. As a biologist, I tend to see the world from an evolutionary perspective. That is, we look at things not from year to year or minute to minute, but over long periods of time. And when you look at this planet over longer perspectives, what's happening today becomes crystal clear. Let me give you one example. I want to read to you a passage from a pamphlet from the World Watch Institute that came out in 1994. It's about the world's forests. Imagine a time-lapse film of the Earth taken from space. Play back the last 10,000 years, sped up so that a millennium passes by every minute. For more than 7 of the 10 minutes, the screen displays what looks like a still photograph. The blue planet Earth, its land swathed in a mantle of trees. Forests cover 34% of the land. Aside from the occasional flash of a wildfire, none of the natural changes in the forest coat are perceptible. The agricultural revolution that began about 10,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution that transforms human existence in the film's first minute, is invisible. After 7.5 minutes, the lands around Athens and the tiny islands of the Aegean Sea lose their forest. This is the flowering of classical Greece. Little else changes. At 9 minutes, 1,000 years ago, the mantle grows threadbare in scattered parts of Europe, Central America, China, and India. Then 12 seconds from the end, 2 centuries ago, the thinning spreads, leaving parts of Europe and China bare. 6 centuries ago, 6 seconds from the end, 1 century ago, eastern North America is deforested. This is the Industrial Revolution. Little else appears to have changed. Forests cover 32% of the land. In the last 3 seconds after 1950, the change accelerates explosively. Vast tracts of forest vanish from Japan, the Philippines, and the mainland of Southeast Asia, from most of Central America and the Horn of Africa, from Western North America and Eastern South America, from the Indian subcontinent and sub-Saharan Africa. Fires rage in the Amazon basin where they never did before, set by ranchers and peasants. Central Europe's forests die, poisoned by the air and rain. Southeast Asia resembles a dog with mange. Malaysian Borneo appears shaved. In the final fractions of a second, the clearing spreads to Siberia and the Canadian North. Forests disappear so suddenly from so many places that it looks like a plague of locusts has descended on the planet. The film freezes on the last frame. Trees cover 26% of the land. 3/4 of the original forest area still bears some forest growth cover. But just 12% of the Earth's surface, 1/3 of the initial total, consists of intact forest ecosystems. The rest holds biologically impoverished stands of commercial timber and fragmented regrowth. This is the present, a globe profoundly altered by the workings or the failings of the human economy. So when you look at it in that perspective and realize that 2/3 of the planet's forests have fallen in the last 40 years, you realize that something fundamental has happened in your lifetimes. And it's a rate of destruction that simply cannot be and will not be sustained. And it's not just forests. I want you to consider some of the other changes that are going on at the same time. I remind you that it took 2.5 million years for our species and our ancestors to finally reach 1 billion people about 1830. So for 2.5 million years, there were never 1 billion human beings on this planet. Today, we are adding 1 billion people every 11 years. We're adding people at the rate of 3 a second. That's over 250,000 a day, over 90 million a year, and that rate is speeding up. So you can see if you were to plot human population over 2.5 million years, for virtually 99.9% of that time, the curve is flat. Only in the last pencil width of time do you suddenly get an acceleration with the curve of population leaping literally straight off the page in the last pencil width of time. That obviously can't go on. If we're very lucky, if, for example, overnight everybody on the planet becomes a vegetarian and we begin to share our food equally around the planet and we're able to stop the loss through pests and disease and so on, we have enough capacity here to sustain 7.5 billion people. Remember, we're at 5.6 billion now. But that requires that everybody become vegetarian and we share our food equally with everyone. If not, projections are that we'll hit 10 billion within another 40 years. I don't believe that we'll hit that myself, because I think there has to be a major die-off of human populations because the planet can't sustain it. If we're adding human beings at such an explosive rate, It's one of the great tragedies that at the very time the human numbers are skyrocketing, total global agricultural food production has been dropping every year since 1984. And that's because we're losing of the order of 25 billion tons of agricultural topsoil every year. That's the equivalent of the entire wheat growing capacity of Australia being lost every year. So populations are growing, agricultural food production is declining. Now, when I was a kid growing up in London, Ontario, our high school teachers said, well, the oceans are the source of protein. The oceans cover 71% of the planet. There are limitless reserves of fish protein in the ocean. Well, the FAO, the FAO of the United Nations reports that of the 17 major fisheries on the planet, and remember that fish are the major source of animal protein for over 1 billion people on Earth. The total amount of fish protein that comes from the oceans is equal to chickens and cows combined. It's a major source of protein. Of the 17 major fisheries in the world, 15 are already in serious decline. So we're not fishing our resources sustainably, we're mining them to extinction. And you only have to come to Canada to see that. Go to the East Coast and see the people who sustained themselves on northern cod for 500 years and see now the consequences when they become extinct. Go to fishing communities all up and down the coast of Vancouver, British Columbia, and see what they're saying now about the Department of Fisheries and Oceans plans and what's going to happen to the commercial fishery. If food decline and population growth weren't enough, they're just two of many other problems. Toxic pollution. When Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, her focus at that time was on pesticides, chemical pesticides, and their impact in the food chain, where they were concentrated up the food chain and biomagnified hundreds of thousands of times. Theo Colburn has just published a book this year called Our Stolen Future, which takes the concerns that Rachel Carson had to a new level. Because as she points out, the rate of pollution of the planet has accelerated many, many times. The statistics she gives on the number of pesticides, the volume, the sheer weight, for every American, for example, over 8.8 pounds of pesticides are sprayed in the United States alone. The amount of use of chemical pesticides is staggering. And what she has discovered is that not that these chemicals are causing cancer, but chemicals like PCBs, dioxin, DDT, furans, and some of the materials found in plastics that leach out of the plastic, you know those big plastic bottles you put in water coolers, the plastic pipes you have to carry water in your houses, the plastic liners in tins and paper containers are leaching out molecules that are behaving as female hormones. And the consequence of that is absolutely staggering, because now what's being found is you don't need high concentrations of these molecules. The hormones act at very, very low concentrations of the order of parts per billion or trillion for their effect. A few years ago, Pierre Belland in Quebec looked at a beluga whale that washed up on the shores of the St. Lawrence and discovered concentrations of PCB at 500 parts per million. That is 10 times the level considered to be toxic waste in the body of a beluga. And these molecules are now circulating. I remember vividly talking to a CEO of a major multinational forest company, and he said, look, our pulp mills put out dioxin at infinitesimally small amounts. He said, why, that pulp mill there only puts out the equivalent of 1 sugar cube of dioxin a year. Unfortunately, 1 sugar cube is a concentration far above what you need in that area to have massive effects. And what Colburn has found that's really terrifying is that a woman exposed to very low concentrations at very critical times in pregnancy can have a profound effect on her fetus that you may not detect until that fetus, boys and girls, is an adult. So we now have very small concentrations of molecules in the environment that can induce an effect that you won't see for a generation. I remind you a few years ago that scientists at McGill were looking at the levels of PCBs in breast milk of women, and they decided they'd better get a control level to compare this group with. They selected a group of Inuit women high up above the Arctic Circle who are living in one of the most pristine areas on the planet, and they thought that would be the comparison, and they were shocked to discover the highest levels of PCBs ever found in human beings. There's nowhere we can go on this planet and escape the toxic debris of human activity. Our activity has become so strong that we are actually changing the very atmosphere that supports us. It's not just the acid rain that is destroying the Black Forest in Germany and forests on the northeastern part of North America, but you all know about the effect of CFCs on the ozone layer. And think about that. We've known that CFCs break down ozone since 1974. We've known that there were alternatives to the CFCs that were used since 1979. We've known there was a hole in the ozone layer above the Antarctic since 1984. And yet CFCs will still not be phased out until after the year 2000. And here was a case where there was a clear-cut cause, effect, and alternatives, and companies like DuPont fought against any elimination or restriction on CFCs all the way down the line. Now you take something as complex as global warming or climate change, where the factors and the degree of effect are not nearly as well specified, and you can see that governments are going to be, and industries are going to be very reluctant to act. In December of last year, over 2,000 scientists from the climatology scientific community signed a statement that said that not only is climate change happening, but that human beings are a significant contributor to this phase of global warming that's happening. And yet the media continue to act as if global warming is controversial. It's not. There are a few nuts in the scientific community who will disagree. There are a few scientists who are being paid very heavily by the energy sector to lobby against any restrictions on CO2 emission, but the overwhelming majority of the scientific community agrees that climate change is happening and that human beings are a significant factor. And I remind you, this all-party standing committee on the environment, on which Paul Martin, our finance minister, sat, on which Sheila Copps, our one-time energy minister, and the deputy prime minister sat, and both of them signed a statement from the all-party standing committee that said the danger of global warming is second only in its consequences to all-out nuclear war. That's how serious it is. And yet the government's inaction on climate change is nothing short of criminal. Along with the deforestation I talked to you about or read to you in that article, the deforestation, the pollution, the habitat loss is resulting in the extinction of an estimated 50,000 species a year. And I was shocked to see just last week that the United Nations has increased that estimate to up to 70,000 species are going extinct every year. That gives you an idea of the magnitude of what's going on. Explosive population growth, rapid loss of food production from the oceans and from the soil, toxic pollution around the earth, change in the atmosphere, loss of wilderness areas, and species extinction. The media continue to act as if people who raise environmental concerns are either fuzzy-headed tree huggers, dope-crazed hippies, eco-terrorists, or neo-Luddites. And that's absolute nonsense. They are not. The people who are leading the call for change in human activity to confront the crisis that faces us are some of the leading scientists on the planet. I want to give you, or read to you just a bit from a press release from the Union of Concerned Scientists. It's called World Scientists Warning to Humanity. It was signed by over 1,600 senior scientists from 71 countries in the world, including over half of all living Nobel Prize winners. Not a bad group to have signed on, okay? This was released in November of 1992, and let me just read you a couple of parts from it. Human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. No more than one or a few decades remain. Let me repeat that. No more than one or a few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost and the prospects for humanity immeasurably diminished. We, the undersigned, senior members of the world scientific community, hereby warn all of humanity what lies ahead. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided, and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. Amazing stuff to come from some of the most conservative people in our society. You know what? CTV and CBC didn't even cover it. The Globe and Mail didn't report it. The New York Times and the Washington Post rejected it as not newsworthy. Not newsworthy when over half of all living Nobel Prize winners are telling us we may only have 10 years to save a future for our children, and that's not newsworthy? What on earth is going on?
They're not.
Why can't we do anything about it? The greatest environmental problem we face, and I'm asked this all the time, what do you think is the most important environmental problem we face? The greatest problem we face is the human mind. It is the values and the beliefs that affect the way we perceive the world. And I'd like to discuss two. I've got a list of many of the beliefs that we have that prevent us from seeing what's going on, that literally blind us to what's going on. Let me say before, I've got a list of about a dozen of these. I'm only going to cover two of them tonight, and you'll get an idea of what the challenge is. But you know, you and I may sit here and see the same thing. You and I can sit here and see this woman standing here with a sign. But when we go home and describe what we saw, I'm sure that you and I are going to see and interpret this in a very different way. Just talk to a man and a woman about words like family, love, community, and you'll be amazed at how different the perspectives are. Talk to someone living on Bay Street as a street person and someone walking through Bay Street as a business person, and you'll get radically different perspectives on the economy. Talk to Israelis and Arabs about Palestine. Talk to Catholics and Protestants about Northern Ireland. We learn to see the world through the beliefs and values that are in our brains. And I believe that there are beliefs and values now that have spread throughout humanity that blind us to the reality of what's going on, and ultimately, therefore, lead us to be an incredibly destructive species. As I say, I've got a number of these beliefs and values. I just want to discuss two of them. The first one I'd like to discuss is one that is pervasive throughout North America. And I can understand why we believe it. 85% of Canadians live in cities and towns. We live in human-created environments where the major animal in our surroundings is us, human beings, or a few of the domesticated plants and animals that we decide we want to live with. We live in biological deserts in cities, and it becomes easy to assume that human beings are different from other creatures. We're special because we're intelligent, and because we're intelligent, we create our own environment. So the first belief that I think is incredibly destructive is the belief that somehow humans are different and lie outside of the natural world. We control and manage our surroundings. That is an unbelievably destructive notion. I speak many times to groups of children, and one of the things I tell them is, the first thing to remember, boys and girls, is that we are animals. And boy, do their parents get pissed off at me. We are not animals, we're human beings. The very word animal is an insult because we think we're above the animals, right? If you say, boy, I watched you at the party last night, were you ever an animal? That's an insult, right? If I was a wild animal, I'd be bloody insulted by that myself. If you say, you know, I'm always amused when I go into a shopping mall and it says, no animals allowed. Jeez, you know, if you really observed that, you'd never, please let me finish and then you can have your say. We don't like the thought that we are animals. If you say someone's a chicken, that's an insult. If you call someone a snake, if you make a monkey out of someone, you're as stubborn as a mule, as dumb as an ox. These are all insults because we believe that we're not animals, we're above them. But you know, back in the 60s, if I said, look, I'll show you, take off all your clothes, everybody would have jumped up and done that. But today we're more uptight. Go home, take off all your clothes and look at your partner. There's not a hell of a lot of difference, except for size and shape, between us and a cow or a dog. I mean, the plumbing is all basically the same, the organs inside are the same. We are animals. And the thought that we think we're different and special is incredibly dangerous. Consider this. You and I have been sitting in this room together now for almost an hour. There's a very simple calculation. I know Rod and Ruth can do this very easily. You can lead your class through this, which is, from a physics lesson, you can calculate the number of atoms in this entire room by multiplying the volume of air in this room times Avogadro's number, right? Avogadro's number is the number of atoms in a cubic cc of air. So that tells you how many atoms there are in this room. Divide that by the volume of air in your lungs times the number of breaths per minute times an hour times the coefficient of diffusion, and what you'll find is that you now have built into your bodies atoms and molecules that were once a part of my body. And I have built into my body atoms that were once a part of every one of you in this room. Because we don't walk around with a little bubble of air marked Johnny or Mary. What comes out of my nose goes straight up yours. Air isn't empty space. Air is a physical substance that links us all together. People have this conceit that we're running around all independent, we're individuals. Like hell. We are part of a single system embedded in a matrix of air. And we're exchanging stuff back and forth all of the time. And you and I are made up of atoms that were once a part of worms and snakes and birds and trees. And if you're as old as I am, you've got atoms in you that were once a part of Joan of Arc and Jesus Christ. Because air isn't made by some magic air machine. The air that's here has always been here. We just borrow it temporarily and give it back. We're just constantly exchanging what's in that air. We're all linked in that physical matrix of air. And it's the same thing with water. The first science lesson I remember from school was the water cycle, right? Water evaporates in the oceans, forms clouds, rains on the land, runs into rivers and lakes, evaporates. Water is cartwheeling around the planet. And there isn't, again, a water machine that's making water. What's here has always been here. And you know what? You and I are at least 70% water by weight. Some of us are a hell of a lot more. We are basically a big blob of water with a bit of thickener added so we can stand up and do things. And where do you think the bazillions of water molecules in your body came from? You and I are made up of water molecules that came from all of the oceans of the world, that evaporated off the canopy of the Amazon rainforest and the steppes of the Soviet Union, the plains of Canada. We are linked together in a matrix of water. And one of the most amazing, important lessons I ever got was when I was in Japan many years ago, and I met a grade 3 teacher. And she shocked me because she said that most of the students in her class, living in the middle of Tokyo, think that the fish their parents bring home from the supermarket spend their entire lives in styrofoam and saran wrap. And when she told me this, I was absolutely shocked, and I laughed when she told me. And then I did a series of films for children called The Nature Connection many years later in Toronto. And we took two 10-year-olds to a farm north of Toronto. And for 2 days we played with the chickens, we gathered eggs, we milked the cows, we fed the pigs, and we rode the horses, had a wonderful time. The third day I took them to a slaughterhouse. And the 10-year-old boy burst into tears when he suddenly realized that hamburgers and wieners were the meat or the flesh of an animal. And he said, "I'll never eat meat again." Our children are as disconnected from the earth. What this woman does in grade 3 is to give her students a sheet of paper and says, "I want you to write on this sheet everything that you eat for your nutrition that is going to make up your body that wasn't once alive. What do you eat for your body that was not once a living plant or animal?" And of course they all say, "Was Diet Coke a food?" And once you rule out all that stuff, is soy sauce food? What they discover is that all of the students turn in a blank sheet. Because everything that you eat that will make up your bodies was once alive. We are basically a compost heap built from the carcasses of previously living plants and animals that come from the earth. It's the most intimate relationship you can have with another being. Not only do you take it into your mouth, you make that being a part of your own body. And I find that an amazing thing. Not only that, but what we are finding now in molecular biology is that when you begin to analyze DNA, the genetic material that makes us what we are, the DNA shows that we are genetically related to all life on the planet because we evolved from a common ancestor. If any of you saw Jurassic Park, the amazing thing about Jurassic Park was not that the mosquitoes stored in amber had dinosaur DNA, although that's a wondrous thought. But the really amazing thing is that the mosquito DNA and the dinosaur DNA had genes in it that were identical to genes in our bodies. Because we are all kin. We are genetically related to all of life on this earth. And I find it amazing then that any species would ever think, would ever dare to think, that we were not embedded in nature and as dependent on the things that matter as any other being. And Rachel Carson said this in her book, Silent Spring. She said we have to pay attention to the fate of animals because the fate of animals is our fate. They are our kin, and what happens to them is relevant to the way that we live. Well, people tell me the reason we're not animals like other creatures is that we're smart. It's true. Humans apparently are more intelligent than any other creature alive now. But what intelligent creature, knowing that air, water, soil, and other living things were critical for our survival and health, what intelligent creature would then commence to treat air, water, soil, and other living things in the way that we have? How could we ever consider ourselves intelligent knowing that? So I think that one of the toughest challenges we face is this idea, because as urban folk, we think somehow that we're no longer a part of nature. And one of the terrible things about our species as urban creatures is that we are amazingly adaptable. We're not like any other creature. Most other life forms are restricted to a habitat. We aren't. We're so intelligent, we use our brains, and we can adapt ourselves to very different environments. I mean, people have created rich lives in the high Arctic, for God's sake, on deserts, the Kalahari Desert, in the Amazon rainforest, in the Malaysian jungles. My God, there are people that live comfortably in Los Angeles and New York. We are incredibly adaptable as a species. But because we are adaptable, we forget. And I'm always amazed, you know, you have a small group of trees in a city lot, a developer comes along, cuts them down, builds a house, and you know what, a year later you don't even remember. And what happens in an area like this is that all the way along the line we are hammering at our surroundings in the name of development and progress. And our baseline of comparison becomes shallower and shallower. Let me give you a case in point. I live in one of the most wonderful parts of Vancouver, right on the ocean, Kitsilano Park. Now, I want to retire to a place we have on Quadra Island, which is just opposite Campbell River. And we try to get up there once a month. And as we take the last ferry across from Campbell River to Kwathiaski Cove, my kids start getting very excited because we can see herring balls, and we see the birds, the eagles, and we see the salmon fry. And we say, oh, it's so great to get back to our place, which we call Tangwin. It's great to come back to Tangwin, which is a Welsh word meaning blessed peace, because we're back in nature. And then we talked to Dan LeClaire, a man who's 75, lived on Quadra for over 60 years of his life. And he tells us what Quadra was like. Well, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And when he tells us, it makes me want to weep. Because we go out, and in 7 years that we've gone up there, we've caught one large lingcod, and when my wife caught it, she immediately released it and said, there's no way we can kill the first big lingcod we caught. Dan says you could go out any time of the year, any time of the day, and catch a lingcod or a red snapper. There hasn't been a red snapper in our area, Hyacinth Bay, for decades. You used to be able to go out and hear the salmon coming miles away because they were so abundant they would slap on their tails would slap on the surface of the water. You could go out in a punt with a rake, and you could go to the kelp beds and rake your punt full of herring in a matter of 15 minutes. Hasn't been a herring ball in that bay for years. And the problem we face is that being city people, our reference point is a biologically degraded environment. So to us, our reference point says Quadra is a rich, vibrant ecosystem, because we've lost all framework or comparison. And this is what I grieve about in what we're doing in this province. We live in one of the most gifted places in the world. And what we are doing is setting aside tiny pockets. I know that one of the areas that you're fighting for is a matter of, what, a couple of 100 acres. That's nothing. That isn't nature anymore. In fact, that's already been cut. The tragedy is that we have to struggle to preserve even that, and that becomes our reference point. And meanwhile, the forest industries are taking down all of the old growth, which no human being will ever regrow again. There is no human being or company that has ever grown a forest. Only time and nature do that. And when we destroy them, we lose all of our reference points to even begin to learn how nature is put together. And so we end up with a place like Quadra that I think is wonderful and rich, that is really so impoverished compared to what it was 50 years ago. I want to spend, when did I start? 20 after? Okay, so I'd like to spend maybe 10 minutes talking about a more difficult belief and value system, but one that we absolutely have to confront if we are going to come to grips with what a destructive creature we are. We have come to believe, and every politician I've talked to repeats this like a mantra, that economics is the heart of what governments are about. Economics, the economy, are what keep us alive. The economy is the critical thing that will make our community survive and keep us vibrant. If we don't deal with the economy, we are told, we're in deep trouble. The Globe and Mail said it before the last federal election. The Globe and Mail editorial said, there are only 3 issues that matter in this election: the economy, the economy, the economy. Okay? Well, I find this one of the most terrible, destructive ideas we can imagine. Remember that economics is a construct. It's a human invention. People have had economies since the beginning of time. They invented them. Why? They invented them to serve people and communities. They were convenient. They were useful. We created economies to serve people and communities. Now, what a strange thing that has happened today. It's not that way anymore. We are here to serve the economy. Have you ever heard that? You've got to sacrifice for the sake of the economy. Your community's got to give up social services for the sake of the economy. Now, damn it all, 200 years ago, we believed in dragons and devils, and we sacrificed virgins for them and all that stuff. And I thought we got rid of that stuff. But now we're doing the same bloody thing for the economy. The economy is a human construct, and it's there to serve us. Now, what kind of a people, what kind of a community would dare to say that we now have become servants of the economy? What's going on? Well, a few years ago, I realized that my concerns about the environment led me to confront the reality that economics was at the heart of the ecological crisis. So I thought, gee, I better take an economics course. So you know what? I took Economics 101 at UBC. I sat in on it for 2 days, and that's all I lasted. And I had great difficulty with it. But I think I learned enough in those 2 days to know why Hazel Henderson, one of the great critics of economics, has said conventional economics is a form of brain damage. And she's absolutely right. And I'm going to tell you why. First thing this professor did was to get up and say, things like caring, things like cooperating, things like sharing, those are emotional, irrational acts. Acting in self-interest is rational, and that's what economics today is built on. I categorically reject any kind of system that begins with the assumption that selfishness is what it's built on, and that sharing, cooperating, and caring are rational emotional acts. What kind of a construct is that? And then what he did was he put up a slide, a diagram of the economy. And what was it? Whole series of arrows pointing in different ways. Economists love this because it looks very scientific. You know, I mean, they call their activity as science, which it is not. And so you see the raw materials being harvested or extracted, or whatever term you want to use, goes out to the processing mill, then goes to the manufacturer, the retailer, the household. So there are all of these various arrows with arrows going back and forth. And in principle, you see, the reason this diagram is so important is if you know what all of the components are in an economy, then you can tweak it over here and put a little incentive here or a punishment here, tax over here, and you can manage the economy. Okay, that's the idea of what this diagram means. So I had the temerity to say, excuse me, sir, in that diagram, could you tell me where is the ozone layer? Where are the deep underground aquifers? Where are the old growth forests? Where are the oceans? And you know what he said? Oh, those are externalities. Well, if you want to externalize those things, you might as well be on Mars, because it's got no connection to the real world. I want some of you who have children to buy the best book I've ever written, called Nature in the Home. And what it shows is that everything around us comes from the earth. When people tell you this is man-made, don't believe it. Human beings don't make anything. It all comes ultimately from the earth. So economics is a form of brain damage if we think that we can construct a system that will extract from the earth but externalize all the real things that keep us alive. I mean, that is simply, it doesn't make any sense at all. Now, oh, I see I've lost a page. Oh, thank you. Oh, you're good for a lot of things. Thank you. It used to be in other economies, it used to be that money, currency, represented something tangible. Represented some service performed, something created. It represented some object from the earth. Money stood for something. But we've come to a situation in this insane game we're playing where money now stands for money. You and I can now go down to the stock market, buy money, sell money, and make money. Have you ever heard of anything more insane than that? Adding nothing to the earth, buying and selling money to make more money? That's absolutely insane. You remember when the peso began to drop last year, and the American government started to buy up billions of dollars of pesos, and the Mexican government was trying to, because they had to save NAFTA after all, and Mexico was a big partner. They put all that money, and they couldn't stop the peso sliding. Why? Because every day, $1 trillion in the insanity called currency speculation goes on. Governments are not big enough to challenge currency speculators. 3 summers ago, the French franc began to slide. The French government spent billions of dollars trying to buy up French francs, couldn't stop the slide until the speculators stopped. So we have this insane activity called currency speculation, because money doesn't represent anything anymore, where you can make money by adding absolutely nothing to this planet. And money, once it's disconnected from real things, then you can just crank it out as fast as you want. And the problem with that is money grows way faster than real things. So a problem we face here in British Columbia is this. Our trees, our forests are among the richest on the planet. They grow at the rate of 2 or 3% per year. Foresters like to say they add fiber at the rate of 2 or 3% a year. Now, you don't have to be a genius. Even I, and I'm no genius, know if we cut down less than 3% of our forests, in principle, we could have forests forever. Makes no economic sense at all. Why do you want to just take 2 to 3% of your investment a year, when if you clear cut it and put it in the bank, you can make 8%? If you clear cut it and invest it in Papua New Guinea or Malaysia, you can make 20 to 50%. So the economics demands that you destroy the forest, because the money doesn't represent anything. When the forests are gone, who cares? We'll put it in fish. When the fish are gone, we'll put it in computers and biotechnology. Money doesn't stand for anything but itself, and it grows faster than real things. So when I hear companies say, oh, we're coming into your community because we really care, want to inject money, we're going to give you jobs, I say nonsense. If any CEO believes that, if I was a shareholder, I'm not, I don't invest in stocks, if I was a shareholder, I'd fire him. His job isn't to sustain communities or ecosystems, it's to maximize profit as quickly as he can and get out. Because the money can always go anywhere else. So we face this terrible situation where the money currency now is no longer based anywhere or on anything. And because it increases so fast, it becomes incredibly destructive. We now have economists who tell us we can give you economic indicators, how well the economy is doing. It was once GNP, now it's GDP, gross domestic product, which is simply a measure of any exchange that involves money, right? Anything in exchange goods and services that involves an exchange of money adds to the GDP. Now, you all know that governments will turn somersaults to keep the GDP rising. The GDP has become this great icon in our society, an indication. If you ask a politician, how well have you done in your term, they will invariably say, well, during my term, the GDP did such and such. The GDP has become the very criterion of success or failure of our projects, of our activities. Well, you know, the GDP is a really weird thing. Do you know that economists never subtract? The GDP, whatever results in an exchange of money, adds to the GDP. When the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, the GDP in the United States rose by $2 billion, because that's how much it cost that year to clean up. So by that criterion, we ought to spill oil all over the damn place. It's great for the GDP. Ralph Nader says every time there's a car accident, someone gets killed, the GDP rises. He's absolutely right. Now, if you have a big petrochemical plant, I'm sure around Port Moody there's nothing like that, but suppose that you have a petrochemical plant somewhere and it's employing a lot of people, that adds to the GDP. Now suppose that that plant dumps some of its effluent into a river, and it pollutes it, and people downstream from that river depend on it for their drinking water. Let's suppose that there's a very bad spill, and or they dump an excessive amount, and hundreds of people get sick. You know what? That's great for the GDP, because you've got to have ambulances, you've got to have hospitals, nurses, medicine. No doubt you're going to hire lawyers, flowers. All of that adds to the GDP. And then let's suppose it was really a bad spill, and dozens of people begin to die. That's great, because you need undertakers, caskets, grave diggers, limousines. All of that adds to the GDP. And then, if you force the company to clean up its mess, that all adds to the GDP as well. Have you ever heard of such a nutty idea in your life? This is the criterion whereby our politicians are turning somersaults and contorting themselves in order to keep the GDP rising. It's absolutely insane. Now, the ultimate destructiveness of the economic system we've got is that our economists and our financiers and business leaders actually believe not only that steady growth is possible, but it's absolutely necessary. Growth has become the very definition of progress. How well did your company do? Well, we grew by 5% last year. You know what? If you're in a company and you carve out 20% of the market, whatever that is, and you decide, gee, I've got enough employees, I'm making enough money, I'm really happy to stay at that level, and I'm just going to stay where I am, you can't get a loan from the bank. Because if you're not growing, you're considered dead. Now, I can tell you, as Paul Ehrlich at Stanford says, there are only two systems on this planet that really believe that steady growth forever is possible. That's cancer cells and economists. And in both cases, steady growth will result in the same thing, which is death. We live in a finite world, and in a finite world, you cannot grow indefinitely. It's as simple as that. Now, I'm going to show you why this idea of needing to have growth, which we tend to call development in Canada, why growth is such a suicidal thing. Anything growing steadily over time is called exponential growth, right? Now, if something is growing steadily over time, exponentially, it has a predictable doubling time. So if Port Moody is growing at the rate of population of 1% a year, your population will be doubled in 70 years. If it's growing at 2% a year, it'll double in 35 years, at 3% in 24 years, 4% in 18 and a half years. So there is a predictable doubling time, okay? Developers and most politicians and business people love growth and exponential growth. The more the better. They think this is really great. So I'm going to show you why this is insane. I'm going to give you a system comparable. Now we're going to make this a metaphor for the earth, okay? I'm going to give you a test tube full of food for bacteria. And I'm going to put one bacterial cell into that. And the bacteria are going to go through exponential growth, okay? Every minute they're going to double, okay? So at time 0, there's one bacterial cell. At 1 minute, there are 2. 2 minutes, there are 4. 3 minutes, there are 8. That's exponential growth. And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely full and there's no food, okay? The question that's often asked is, when is the test tube only half full? And the answer is, of course, at 59 minutes. Even though you've been going for 59 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, you're only half full. But 1 minute later, you're completely full, right? So at 58 minutes, you're 25% full. 57 minutes, you're 12.5% full. At 55 minutes, you're 3% full. So if at 55 minutes, one of these bacteria was really smart and said, gee, you know, I've been thinking, we may only have 5 minutes left to go. The other bacteria would say, what the hell are you talking about? 97% of the test tube's empty, and we've been around for 55 minutes. And they'd be 5 minutes away from filling it, right? So at 59 minutes, they're no smarter than humans. They say, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We better give lots of money to those scientists, right? Those genetic engineers and computer experts. And by God, they come through. They deliver 3 test tubes full of food. So they quadruple the amount of food in space, right? So what have they bought you? At 60 minutes, the first test tube's full. 61 minutes, the second's full. At 62 minutes, all 4 are full. So by quadrupling the amount of food in space, you buy 2 extra minutes. Now, I guarantee you that no amount of scientific megaproject is going to bring more than a fraction of a percentage of clean air, water, soil, and certainly we're losing biodiversity. We'll never bring back the amount of biodiversity. And there are many, many scientists now who believe that we are long past 59 minutes. And still, those who read the Globe and Mail in the business section fanatically are still trying to prime that pump and say we've got to have growth because that's progress. And all you folks out there that are trying to stop growth, you are trying to halt progress. You're against progress. What they're saying is that they want to continue the suicidal path. I was at a luncheon once, I was in Ontario, in Toronto, that Bob Ray called for a bunch of people in the ethnic community to meet with Prince Charles. And Prince Charles said, look, I want you to tell me, what are the really major issues that we face you face in Canada? So then a black guy got up and said, I came from Jamaica and I'm a bank manager and they treated me like, they told me to go to the back of the bank my first day because they thought I was a janitor. And the Chinese woman got up and said, it's discrimination against us in Chinatown. Anyway, and after a while I got up and I said, I feel like we are in a giant car heading at a brick wall at 100 miles an hour and you're all arguing about where you want to sit in the car. Surely to God it's time to say there's a wall coming up at us, put on the brakes and turn. There are a few people in that car saying, for God's sake, stop, but they're locked in the trunk. Right? And all the guys are still arguing about growth, we need development. I don't know whether that's got anything to do with Port Moody. I just make the observation in terms of my... We are... As long as I normally give a whole hour talk on economics, and I've run out of time. But economics, I can tell you, is the current rush to globalize the marketplace, to try to establish free trade throughout the world, is absolutely destructive of local ecosystems and local communities. And I'm astonished that so many politicians so easily mouth the words about the need for growth and the need to carve out a niche in the global marketplace when it totally trashes people's livelihoods and communities. It's suicide. What?
They have suicide debt. They don't have any soil left.
So something's wrong. Now the question then is, what do we do? I hope you've got an idea what I mean when I say that unless we can break through the perceptual filters that now affect the way we see the world, we will continue to be very destructive. So for example, there are many companies now that are trying to be environmentally responsible, and I take my hat off to them. But until we go deeper and look at the underlying economic assumptions, we will continue, even if we have all of the economically responsible companies in the world, the economic assumptions are inevitably destructive. So we have to come to grips with those. The question is, what do we do? Now, what I would suggest to you is the kind of thing that we're trying to do at the Suzuki Foundation. The reason I set it up, and let me say that I did not want my name on this foundation. I mean, it seems like such an egotistical thing to do. I fought it, but the board decided to put my name on it because they said at least your name tells people they know where you're coming from. So I very reluctantly allowed my name to be on the foundation, but I'm very proud of what it's doing. And Jim Fulton, our executive director, has been magnificent. What we suggest is, first, take your focus into your local communities. You don't have to believe Greenpeace or me or other environmentalists. Confirm for yourself the unsustainability of the path that we're on. Just talk to anyone who's lived in Port Moody for 60 or 70 years and ask them what it was like when they were young. And ask yourself, is the continued development in this area what you want? Go to Kelowna, for heaven's sake, and see a community absolutely hell-bent on suicide. We love an area to death, and the reason we do it is that we think that we have to have more growth and more development in order to sustain this area, and we kill it. So talk to your elders and ask whether we're on a path that is at all sustainable. And begin to ask yourself, what the heck do we mean by progress? Think, for heaven's sake, think beyond the next week's paycheck or the stock dividend on your investment or next year's salary increase. Think about your children. And I tell young people today, the decisions that are going on today are being made and will affect you. It's your future that politicians are deciding on today. And the tragedy with our political system is politicians are beholden and sensitive to people who vote. Children don't vote. So I'm sorry, however much politicians may come to high schools and mouth off to you, they don't care about you because they care about getting their message to your mom and dad who vote. And I say, fine. You go to your mom and dad, who are the two of the most important people on this planet. They're doctors, lawyers, business people, politicians. And you tell them, Mom and Dad, I'm worried. What is going to be left for me? Will I be able to grow up in a world as rich with opportunity as the one that you grew up in as a child? And if the answer is no, the question is why? And why aren't we doing something about it? What we are trying to do at the Suzuki Foundation is to try to lift our sights from the immediate battles over this watershed or that forest or that polluting plant and say we've got to get at the underlying causes of our destructive path. If we don't come to grips with the underlying causes, we're only going to spend our time trying to stamp out brush fires. We're going to deal with symptoms. So we ask ourselves, what are the non-negotiable bottom lines? What do we absolutely require to give us a quality of life? And I look at it in the following way, and I'm writing a book on this. The working title is called Basic Needs. We are animals. And as animals, we have an absolute requirement for clean air, clean water, clean soil, biodiversity, and energy. If we don't have those things, we don't live. So whatever we do, the first consideration is you don't mess with the air. You don't mess with the water. You don't mess with the soil. You don't endanger other species. That's an absolute requirement. And let me tell you something. When people say, we can manage the quality of the water, or we can manage the air, or we can manage this rainforest, you tell them, you don't understand science. Scientists don't know enough to be able to manage anything wild. That's not a denigration of science. As Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner at Caltech, once said, what scientists are trying to do is figure out how a chess game works by only being able to see 2 squares at a time. That's the extent of our vision into the natural world. So anyone who tells you that they can manage wild things, or air, water, soil, is either stupid or they're lying. Because no scientist, no organization knows how these things are made up and how they interact. We can't. So first we have to protect, above all else, those things that keep us physically alive as animals. But we are also social animals. And I believe that there are social needs that we have that are every bit as important as our physical or biological needs. We must have an opportunity for love. We must have an opportunity for family, for community, for full employment, for justice and security. Those things should be non-negotiable in any society. You've got to build a system that can assure those social needs. But I believe we have another need that is every bit as important as biological and social, and that is our spiritual needs. We have spiritual needs that we don't seem to pay much attention to because you can't put a dollar and cents value on them. But I believe they are every bit as critical for our well-being. And you can each define what your spiritual needs are. But I think we must define those needs and say, wherever I live, whatever community I live in, I want to build that community on these values. On my needs as an animal, on my needs as a social being, on my needs as a spiritual being. And then we begin to reconstruct the way our society is. And that's what we're trying to do with the foundation. Build a vision of how it looks to live in a way that is in balance with the rest of the planet. And once we have a vision of where we want to get, then we want to try to develop strategies for transforming ourselves that way. What are the indications of how we can get there? And then, because I believe that this must come from the bottom up, not from the top down. We've got to go out into grassroots, not tell them what to do, but work with them to try to work out a strategy for each community being able to develop a long-term sustainable strategy. People often say to me, how can you hang in there? You've been involved in this for over 30 years. How can you maintain your optimism? Well, I have children and I have grandchildren. I have no choice. It's a luxury to say, well, there's nothing we can do. It's a cop-out. When you have a commitment into the future, you do your best. But I want to end by saying what gives me enormous hope is this. If I had come to Port Moody 10 years ago, and I had said to you 10 years ago, you know, I think in 1996 there will be no Soviet Union. I think in 1996 the Berlin Wall will be down and there'll only be one Germany. I think in 1996 the Israelis and the PLO will have come to some kind of accord and Yasser Arafat would win a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. If I had said to you, I think in 10 years apartheid will be gone and Nelson Mandela will not only be out of jail but president of South Africa, you would have had me carted away as a certified loony. And because no one can predict what can happen, I know that I'm not going to save the planet or this country or this province. My organization is not going to save the world. But when there are more and more people all doing their thing in their local community, we can add up to a great power, and miracles are possible. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wave your sign. Go at it. I didn't want to stay too late, but I'm certainly willing to answer questions for a little while. So please, you've been very patient with me, and I thank you for that. If you have questions now, I'm happy to try.
Hey, what can we do about mobilizing the silent majority in the city of Port Moody?
Well,
We have thermal coming on stream in the next few years, perhaps operating 24 hours a day, spewing God knows what up into the air, and warming the waters of the inlet. We have about 200 dedicated people in Port Moody trying to stop neighborhoods 3 and 4 from developing. But we cannot get the numbers that Northeast Council demands of us. We just simply can't get them.
200 people.
There are more developers and lobbyists for development and progress, so-called, in this area, and we cannot mobilize the silent majority here in Port Moody, of which there are thousands. What can we do about that?
If there is a silent majority, they vote. Do they not? That is your ultimate power. The problem we face today is our political system. It's the best one that I know of, but very imperfect. Is that a politician, when elected, is immediately beholden to the people that fund his or her campaign. Now, one of the major problems we face today is that most people cannot afford to run for office, even at the municipal level, and lose. So you don't see in government, you don't see people who are full-time parents. You don't see people who come from the labor class. You don't see many farmers. You don't see people who don't have the resources to make a run and lose. So it's not surprising that over 70% of our politicians come from two areas. They come from business and they come from law, because those are the two areas where people can afford to take a chance and lose. And when they take a chance and they're funded, the big money comes from big companies. And the big companies cover their asses by funding people on the left and the right. The NDP gets money from big companies, maybe not quite as much, but they get big companies giving them money as well. And so I think one of the tragedies is we've got to work, and this is one of the things that was exciting to me about the National Party in the last federal election. They wanted to get rid of all of that. They wanted people to be able to run without having to depend on that kind of funding. They wanted them to be able to get, I don't remember how national, but there was a limit of $100. But that, I think those two things really stack the deck. If you have such a disproportionate, you've got to rally behind people who don't come from business, who don't come from law, who may have a different perspective and run. Not that I've got anything necessarily against business people and lawyers. The problem is your profession skews the way you look at the world. I'm a geneticist. Whenever I stand in front of an audience like this, I see mutants everywhere. I just can't help myself. Oh, there's one over there, right. Because we see the world through our discipline. So a business person or a lawyer, they see the world in a jurisdictional or an economic sense. We need to broaden that out. And that's got to come from the grassroots. You've got to support and put your effort behind candidates who don't have the resources, who have a different perspective.
What can they do once they get in office?
Well, they're going to. If they're elected and they're not beholden to the developers, if they're not beholden.
People running for public office, and if they do not get the support of the majority of the community once in office, they can't do anything either, because eventually they cave in to the pro-lobbyists.
There are some other questions at the back of the room,
And
too.
that's exactly
Sylvia,
what's happened here in Park Moody.
Sylvia, there's some other questions at the back.
I can sense the frustration.
Maybe ask.
Well, I'll sit
Thank you.
Thank you.
There was a question I saw back. The people at the front have an advantage. I saw someone had it. Oh, sorry. Okay. There's a microphone there at the back. Hi, Finn.
Enjoyed your talk tonight. Excellent points. A couple that really concern me and touched on population and greed. You used it in a couple of analogies, brought it up a little bit, the test tube as well. The car heading into a wall. What I was wondering your thoughts on who's driving that car. My concern, or I think, if I look around, it's not business or government, but it's people. And the two things I think are consumers and greed. You've touched on greed, but do you think that that is the case?
Well, I think we are being driven ultimately, and there are two books I'd strongly recommend to people. There's one called Global Dreams, which is a very powerful book that looks at the global situation, and When Corporations Rule the World by David Corton. It's clear that we're on a path now to globalize the economy and give over any hope of controlling the economy to the transnationals. The transnational corporations, by definition, have no allegiance to a country or a people. Their perspective is global, and they are beyond control of governments. Even John Maynard Keynes in the 30s said, look, exchange things like the arts and sports and have all kinds of international exchanges, but keep economies domestic. Don't lose control of your economy. We're going exactly the opposite. And I don't understand why politicians seem to want, they're elected to represent us, and they're abrogating that responsibility by gladly letting the transnationals come in and thereby lose any hope of having any control over them. It's the globalization of the economy. It's NAFTA and free trade and the APEC agreement and Maastricht, all of the GATT, all of these things are driving us to globalize the economy and the market. Now, I think if you look at the history of consumption, when, you know that you're too young, but there was a Great Depression in the 30s, and some of us remember it. When the Depression was a terrible time of suffering, that's what gave strength to the CCF, which became the new NDP. And what saved society and pulled us out of the Depression was World War II. Wars are tremendously good at pulling economies out of the doldrums. And as the Second World War was coming to an end, the American business people said, what are we going to do? Our economy is now really pumping out weapons and machines. We've got to keep the economy going. So they established the Council of Economic Advisors to the President, and they came out very clearly with their answer in 1947, when the chairman of the Economic Council said, we must make consumption an American way of life. We must teach people to worship at the altar of consumption. We must buy, use up, throw away, and buy some more. And boy, did it work. So we have the situation where today, the basic way, the main way that we are seen by governments, and certainly we often see ourselves that way, is we see ourselves as consumers. When the economy does a downturn, politicians get mad at us. Consumers don't have confidence in the economy. We got to do everything we can to gain consumer confidence, so they'll start spending, because that's our job. You know, in the last 40 years, the average size of the Canadian family has dropped by over 50%, right? We've stopped having children. And yet the average size of a house has increased by over 60%. Why? There are fewer people living in them, but they're getting bigger. Because we need room for all the crap that we're buying. That's why. You know that over half of all the purchases we make in a hardware store or a department store are impulse purchases. That is, we had no intention of buying them. We walk into the store, we go, oh, gee, I didn't know there was a thing like that. I got to have that, and you buy it. That's what all of this vaunted consumption and our economy is all about, is to pump out products that will inveigle you to buy. You go to a supermarket, there are 25,000 different choices you have. Over 200 breakfast cereals. None of them will give you a proper nutritional diet, but man, do you have choice. That's what our economy is all about. It's crazy and it's insane. And when we use 100 times as much as the average person in Somalia or Bangladesh, in terms of our impact on the planet, we have a major population problem.
Should people in, say, environmental activists concentrate on corporations and the attitudes of CEOs and corporations?
My answer to that is let 1,000 flowers bloom, or whatever the thing, Mao's phrase was. We want diversity. So I say, let an environmental group grow that wants to stop spraying pesticides in a schoolyard or along public boulevards. Let a group grow that wants to fight the transnationals. Let all kinds of environmental groups go and find the one that suits your particular stage of development. We need to, you know, there are people that say we're wasting all this money because we've got so many environmental groups that people don't know where to give money. And I say I'm against any kind of coalition. Let lots of environmental groups grow up, and they'll select what level they want to act on. And the sum total becomes a very powerful force. Nobody knows what the critical thing is going to be that will tip it. So let's have lots.
Good evening, David, and thank you again for being a sane voice in an insane time. Two things. One thing I think people can do with the upcoming provincial election is to ask politicians and to listen, really listen to what they have to say. Ask them and judge them. Are they acting as if the future really matters, or are they concerned about the fast buck in the next few years? The next point, and I'm afraid this is going to be a commercial if you let me, you can also vote for Oz Cat from the Green Party. He's a Clackwater arrestee, he's a grandfather, and he's 71 years old. Thank you.
Let me say that we face a real dilemma, even in the political system, and that is this. A politician, once elected, their very first priority is to start worrying about getting reelected. Now, before Mike Harcourt was elected, I went to see him to talk to him about forest policy and told him very strongly what my position was and what he ought to be doing. And his answer to me was this. He said, Dave, I have no intention of repeating the same mistake Dave Barrett did. I have no intention of being a one-term government. And I said, you bastard, you have no intention then of standing for anything, because you're going to be so busy about getting worried about getting reelected, you're not going to stand for anything. And it's a terrible fact that a politician has to, and it's not that they're evil or stupid or anything. The political process demands that you make a decision that will come to fruition before the next election. If you don't have something to show for your efforts, it's a waste. So you just have to look at the history of Northern Cod to see this. When a politician is faced with a choice, they can make the right choice, let's say ecologically, and get kicked in the head by everybody, or they can punt. They can not do anything and hope that nothing serious will happen in the next year. They will always punt. And the reason is, why should they take the kicking in the head, which may not pay off before the next election? That's why they can't do anything about climate change. It's why they didn't do anything over Northern Cod. And it's why Mifflin is not going to do anything on the salmon.
Good evening, Dr. Suzuki. I don't expect you to be able to provide the answer, but I'm hoping that your response can help the city of Port Moody and its people come up with the answer to a question that I think is really troubling them. And the question I think you've hinted at, and maybe you can help bring it together. You've, I think, tugged at two different strings, and I think they need to be tied together and shown how they're related. You've addressed, for example, the exponential growth of people on the world, and you've indicated, and I'm myself quite familiar with the statistics, and I'm extremely concerned about it, and plan in a further adventure of my life to work very diligently towards trying to address world problems. But right now, I'm dealing with community problems, and you've addressed world problems in terms of population, but how do you as a community deal with that growing population? Those are the two strings, the growing exponential population of the world and the fact that the growth, which you've hinted at as being both a negative in the view of it as development when it's seen as an economic tool, but what about when there's no choice, when people are coming to your area because either A, they have no other place to go, or B, they've been forced from their homeland, or C, they have no prospects where they live.
Sorry, are you telling me Port Moody is taking all of the refugees of the planet and they're pouring in here?
No. No, I'm not, but I'm sure you know, Mr. Suzuki, that we have a higher rate of acceptance of refugees from other parts of the world than any other industrialized nation.
Is that the major problem of pressure in Port Moody?
No, it's not, but again, and I don't want to enter into debate, sir.
I'm not debating, I'm just curious to get...
We have the only growth area of people between the ages of 25 and 35 in all of North America, with the exception of Seattle. Because people are moving here, because they don't have jobs, because, again, as you've indicated, the environment and the economy is driving them out of their homes, their traditional homes, either in the prairies or eastern Canada, you name it. They're moving here. The fisheries of the East Coast are driving Easterners here. They're coming here, whereas an extreme pressure in population. You yourself, I think, through your foundation, have been involved with the Greater Vancouver Regional District in some of its discussions about watershed and other issues. What's your response to the regional plan in terms of trying to accommodate that growth we're going to experience over the next 25 to 30 years?
Well, first of all, you stop encouraging development of the kind that is going to trash the things in this area. I mean, I cannot believe that you're just kind of sitting here helplessly as all of these people are rushing in to fill up Port Moody. Are you telling me that your city council or your developers aren't saying, hey, we've got an opportunity here to bring more people in? If you think that growth is progress, it shapes the way that you perceive the world and go about. And I would say that the challenge now is to say, what are the values that make Port Moody a wonderful community and a place to live? All right? Then, how do we go about preserving those values? Once you've come to an agreement that these are the things that make this place special, you protect those at all costs, and you begin to design legislation, you give bylaws that will ensure that those values will be protected.
Come to City Hall and I'll show them to you.
And that's your responsibility. You're a politician. I don't know.
But
I'd just like to say I'm one of those very small percentage you referenced who come from the working class, who fund their own campaigns, and I'm not beholden to anyone other than my own conscience, and I try to do the right thing, and I'm interested in what people have to say, and I believe we've tried to do exactly what you said, address the total long-term vision of what is sustainable in Port Moody, what's valuable as a lifestyle, and what we can do.
This is a question period, Councillor.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's
I'm
okay.
sorry, I don't mean to enter into debate, but I think we've tried to do that in response.
We're not listening to you anymore.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think you have an elected representative here who says, in fact, that your council is doing the thing. And I have nothing to say about that. If that's the case, then I think great. Then I wonder what the hell are people all steamed up about?
I'm a student from Suzuki here with the Science Projects, and in my experience being a student in school, there seems to be a fairly common sort of attitude amongst students. It's as if people feel as there's like nothing they can do, and I know you've probably heard this many times from students, that a lot of youth feel helpless. It's not that they're greedy or they're self-centered. Well, maybe some of them are. Can't make that assumption, but there seems to be an air of hopelessness amongst students, and you know, you see, there's students. These youth are bombarded by media, by advertising, by newspapers saying how youth are horrible criminals, blah blah blah. We can't do this, can't do that, or else these youth are going to come around with their knives and their guns and. I'm not. Okay. Okay. I'm expressing my point of view. This is not a debate. This is not a debate. I'm expressing my point of view. Okay. We all have the right to our points of view and our opinions here. This is not a debate. Now, I'll get on with my question now, if you allow me to. How can these students and these youth come to feel empowered and find a place within the area of activism, social issues and environmental issues? How can they come to find a place? How can they find their place there? How can they find their place in the community when everybody is pulling them away from their communities, pulling them away from the environment, pulling them away from social issues? How can we solve this problem? Because I feel fairly empowered myself, but there are other students who don't. They feel like there's nothing they can do. Personally, I don't feel that way.
No, I understand. I think that's a very heartfelt and a very real question, and I'm amazed at the rudeness of an elder. I'm sorry. I really respect elders, but you're making it difficult, because I think we live in a world that has just been hammered by a tremendous amount of change, and we've become incredibly dysfunctional. You see, we've always thought that more science and technology and all these wonderful things was the key to having a better life. And often the very things that we thought were the symbols of a better life, like beginning with a car, have become the things that have destroyed communities and ecosystems. So that you're now paying the price for an unparalleled period of growth and development since 1950. Since the end of the Second World War, people were just open for all of this stuff. And our surroundings have changed enormously. You just have to look at families and how screwed up families are now. And I don't know what the solution is. What worries me is I see school boards being impelled under this whole thing of economic pressure to and I certainly see it in universities. We're all going for the buck. So in Toronto, in Ontario, in Toronto, the school board says, yes, we'll give you an exclusive right, Pepsi-Cola, to put Pepsi-Cola dispensers in all of the schools in Toronto. We're selling logos. We're selling every opportunity to let the private sector come in. You only have to go to elementary school and see all of the beautiful posters that are being given free from the forestry industry, from the atomic energy industry, from the oil and gas industry, because teachers don't have the ability to go out and get these things. They don't have the budgets, and so they're glad to get this propaganda and stick it in the schools. I think that there are major problems. The schools themselves are now being seen as the feeder to this economic engine. We're preparing you to go into that. And where do you get your optimism? I mean, to me, the hope is that the more opportunity there is for you to experience nature in a fundamental way, the more you will find your lives totally changed. I'm a big fan of the Trek program. There's only one program at Prince of Wales in Vancouver that transforms students. There should be nature all over throughout your career. I've been trying to get every schoolyard in Canada to develop a butterfly garden, because I think that where you spend a substantial part of your life ought to be a place where you see nature instead of a concrete jungle. And, you know, those are very airy-fairy opportunities. But let me tell you, you guys are very lucky here. If you look at what's going on over in Mossam Creek and all of the other creeks now where that program is expanded, I mean, and I know from what Ruth and Rod say, kids go through that experience changed for the rest of their lives, right? Isn't that right? We need to get out there, and you still have some of it right here. And boy, if there was a good issue for you to get involved in, I would say it's the future of that little bit of forest here that's being fought over. If there's anything that's right up students' alleys, it's that. Get involved. Well, I can't go on forever tonight. Let me take you and the fellow following you, and let's call it at that.
Just a short question, and only a question. You made a strong point of how important the population explosion is in this whole story. And one accepts that it is fundamental to the whole problem. I wondered what your ideas were, what your thoughts were, and your proposals are for the world to manage that fundamental problem so that the rest can then be...
Well, clearly population growth there are limits, and we can't sustain it. I asked Ed Wilson at Harvard, how many people could the planet support sustainably forever? And he said, if you want to live the way you do in Canada and North America, 200 million. There are 5.6 billion of us. And he's saying, if you want to live at the level we live, 200 million. If all 5.6 billion people on the planet lived the way we do in British Columbia, we would need 2 more planets, okay? Those of us in the industrialized countries now possess 83% of the planet's wealth. And we say, for our well-being, we need more. That means for the 80% of the planet that are not in industrialized countries, we leave them less than 20% of the resources and wealth, okay? The fact is, in terms of impact on the planet, we are the problem, not the developing world. Because we use, as I said, 100 times as much as the average person in Somalia or Bangladesh. So you have to multiply Canada's population by 100 to get our population impact in Somalian equivalents, okay? So that means we got 30 billion Somalians in Canada. So we're the problem. When you multiply the United States 300 million by 100, then you come out with 30 trillion Somalian equivalents. Sorry, 30 billion Somalian equivalents. Am I right there? 3 billion of us, right. So we are the major assault on, do you follow my reasoning on that? Population, of course, cannot grow indefinitely. But in terms of the current destructiveness, it's us. And the frightening thing is this. China and India alone have twice as many people as we do in the industrialized world. China wants to reach our level within the next 10 years. India is heading on an economic boom where they want to surpass us at some time early in the next century. If China and India follow the path that we've followed, and they've got every right to do that because we have not been willing to give up one bit, if they follow our path, it doesn't matter what we do here, they're going to take the rest of us down with them.
But given all that, the question of the growth of population...
We've got to set the example by cutting back our consumption. We're not replacing ourselves. We've got population under control, but our federal government thinks growth is crucial, so our immigration policy is now being used not because we sympathize with terrible regimes. We're using immigration to pump our economy because we think growth is the necessary thing. But we are already over-consuming. We're already bloated. And if we don't cut back, why should anybody in the developing world want anything less than we've got? If we don't set the example, there's no way the other countries are going to say, oh, you're right, we're not going to do that. So the challenge is here. It's not in India or China. It's here, I think.
Just two short questions. You sort of answered most of the first one. I just wanted to know what hope do you feel we have to stop such an enormous amount of growth and to live sort of harmoniously in
Well, I mean, it's a very depressing thing to think that half of all Nobel Prize winners tell us we may only have 10 years to turn things around, and it doesn't even get covered in our popular media. I mean, I don't tend to believe in conspiracies, but I find it very weird that any time an economist from the Fraser Institute shoots off his mouth, he gets full national coverage. But half of all living Nobel Prize winners... But as I say, we all have to do the best we can. I'm just one person. You're one person. But when you add it all up, it amounts to something. And as I said at the end, I never would have believed 10 years ago that Nelson Mandela would be out of prison and Prime Minister of South Africa. Thank you.